Assalamu alaikum. Good morning, everyone. Today we continue our course on the history of English literature. Last time we discussed chapter 8. Today we are going to discuss chapter 9, early 19th century points. Um, in this chapter, if we go back with our memory, we'll find that the mainstream of poetry in the 18th century had been orderly and polished. Um, Remember when we talked about the 18th century as the age of reason? Actually, there was no much feeling for nature at that time. But in the early 19th century, and in particular in 1798, with the publication of the Lyrical Palace by William Wordsworth and Samuel Taylor Coleridge, um, there was a kind of a drastic change, a sort of a shock where the language used in poetry was so simple or too simple. And this was a kind of change in the language used in poetry and in the topics discussed, in the attitude, and even in the definition of poetry itself, according to the Romantics. So, the publication of Lyrical Ballads by William Wordsworth and Samuel Taylor Coleridge was the beginning of the Romantic Age. This was the beginning. It indicated or ushered for the appearance of the Romantic Age in poetry. Together, and was a third point called Southey. They were often known as the Lake Poets. The lake because they like the Lake District. This is an area in England where you can find nature in its virgin form. And they lived nearby as well. They lived in this area, in the Lake District in England. So to start with, William Wordsworth, he was born in 1770 and um, and he died in 1850. And he's known as the poet of nature. William Wordsworth is known as the poet of nature because he loved nature so much. And nature is always there in his discussion of poetry, in his poems, and even in his everyday speech. So, in the preface to the second edition of the Lyrical Ballads, this is like Lyrical Ballads is a collection of poems published, as I said, by Wordsworth and Coleridge. So, in the preface, in the introduction to that collection of poems, Wordsworth set out his theory of poetry, and he even gave a definition of poetry as he said poetry is the spontaneous overflow. That famous definition of poetry by Wordsworth. So the spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings and emotions. So at that time, his views and poetical style were considered revolutionary and strange. Right. In his early career as a poet, Wordsworth wrote poems like An Evening Walk and descriptive sketches. Also, the Prelude, well, one of his poems, is the record of his development as a poet. As a poet, it is actually a philosophical poem. He also wrote lyric poetry. He wrote some of his best lyric poems in the English language, like The Solitary Weeper, I Wander Lonely as a Cloud, which is otherwise known as the Daffodils, Ode on the Intimations of Immortality, Resolution and Independence, etc. We're going to meet quite a few of his poems in this chapter. But one of his best poems is called Tintern Abbey. Okay, this is one of the greatest poems by William Wordsworth. Um, So the best years actually were the earlier years in the life of William Wordsworth. This is when he and Samuel Taylor Coleridge worked together on some of the finest poems in English. Um, and his best poems, as I said, appeared in the Lyrical Palace. Lines composed above Tintern Abbey. This Tintern Abbey was written in 1798 and it appeared in Lyrical Palace. He also wrote Prelude, as I said, wrote Lucy. Lucy is one of his um, important poems. Um, so also Wordsworth's sister, her name was Dorothy, was one of his constant companion and genial critic of both her brother William Wordsworth and Coleridge. And she had fascinating journal records that that records the day-by-day progress of the two poets during these early years. So we're going to also um, see another poet, another romantic poet called Samuel Taylor Coleridge. He was born in 1772 and died in 1814. So Coleridge was a friend of William Wordsworth, and he wrote four poems for the Lyrical Palace, which the collection of poetry they published together in um, um, earlier in 1798. He also wrote The Rime of the Ancient Mariner. This is the most noteworthy of his poems. One of his greatest poems is called Kubla Khan. He also wrote Christabel, Dejection and Ode, Frost at Midnight. So these are at the top of the list. Um, College also has some lectures on Shakespeare, and they are equally important as well. Um, excuse me. Um, Coleridge actually had a kind of illness when he was young. He was the youngest son of a clergyman, okay, a master person who was a scholar but unworldly. Um, and when he was a child, Coleridge was so sensitive as a child. And both his parents actually showered great affection on him. Um, but he didn't like the family nurse when he was young, and he sought escape in reading tales of adventure and romance. So he was a voracious reader since he was a child. He learned even to read at the age of 4. Um, and so he was able to get an early start on the mountain of books he was to read during his lifetime. When he was a child, he had that illness that left him with painful rheumatism throughout his life. And in those days, doctors seem to have prescribed opium much as a modern doctor would prescribe aspirin. It was a temporary relief for almost any pain. Opium, okay? So opium is a kind of it's a type of natural drug that is illegal nowadays. It's forbidden or illicit by law. But at that time, it was prescribed for him to get relief of the pain, the severe pain he had. So he get a sort of an addict to opium, and actually, some people connect the magic and the beauty of Kubla Khan to this influence of opium on him. Um, So this is the second point we're going to see in this chapter. There are 4 more or 5 points, but we're going just to focus on Lord Byron's. Lord Byron's is one of the romantic poets as well. So his name was George Gordon, otherwise known as Lord Byron. He had Childe Harold's Pilgrimage. This was a poem based on his travels. Also, another poem called Don Juan ranks as one of the greatest of satirical poems, in which he satirized his enemies. The Vision of Judgment is a fine political satire in English as well. The third poet we're going to meet is Percy Bysshe Shelley. He was born in 1792 and died in 1822. And he was a revolutionary figure of Romantic period, Percy Bysshe Shelley. Shelley, when he was studying at Oxford University, he wrote the pamphlet, The Necessity of Atheism, actually, which caused his expulsion from the university. He wrote Queen Mab, The Revolt of Islam, Alaciter. So these are his early poems. Another poem called Prometheus Unbound. Prometheus Unbound is a combination of the lyric and the drum. To be honest, Percy Bysshe Shelley was interested in the old mythology, the ancient mythology of the Greeks and Romans, and most of his poems are based on these mythologies. Shelley wrote also some of the sweetest English lyrics, like Tonight, The Cloud, To a Skylark. So these like odes. Of his many odes, the most remarkable is Ode to the West Wind. Adonais is an elegy on the death of John Keats. John Keats, this is the fifth point we are going to discuss. Shelley was born in 1792, and he comes from a rich family, to be honest. So after some unhappy years at Eton, where he was nicknamed as the Mad Shelley, he went up to Oxford, the Oxford University, from which he was expelled, as I said, because of in 1811 for publishing a pamphlet on the necessity of atheism. So Shelley, personal life of Shelley actually was a kind of chaotic life where he traveled a lot and he married more than a wife, and one of his wives actually committed suicide, and there was a lot of troubles in his personal life. But in general, one of the most important themes in Shelley's poetry is his appreciation and love of nature. So he believed in the healing influence of nature on the human heart. He also aspired for the freedom of humans in general. So he was after the freedom. He wanted every man to be free. He believed in the healing influence of nature, as I said, on the human heart. As a lyric poet, he's among the very greatest. His song is pure inspiration, a thing of light, melody, and grace. And his lyrics represent the highest achievement of romantic poetry. And the beauty and the charm of his lyrics are hardly surpassed by the poems of any other English poet at that time. As I said, some of his most outstanding lyrics are Ode to the West Wind, To a Skylark, The Cloud, Tonight. Okay, so this is Percy Pez Shelley. The last of poets we're going to meet in this chapter is John Keats. John Keats uh, was born in 1795 and he died in 1821. This is another great romantic poet who wrote some excellent poems in his short period of life. He died young at the age of 26. Uh, he is known for his Isabella, a poem that deals with the murder of a lady's lover by her two wicked brothers. The unfinished epic poem Hyperion, modeled on John Milton's Paradise Lost. You remember John Milton, the poet we discussed before. The Eve of St. Agnes is regarded as his finest narrative poem. The story of Lamia also is taken from Burton's Anatomy of Melancholy. He has a poem called Endymion. Okay, he also had some odes like Ode to a Nightingale, Ode on a Grecian Urn, Ode to Pesh, Ode on Melancholy, Ode to Autumn. So these are very famous, poems written by John Keats. But his letters give a clear insight into his mind and artistic development. One more poet called Robert Southey, but he's a minor romantic poet, so we're not going to focus so much on him. So these five poets represent the core of this chapter, and we are going to um, discuss them and know something about their life, about their works, and what they like, and what are the general characteristics or the main characteristics of their poetry. Let me share with you the chapter 9 in the book so we can highlight some paragraphs that we should focus on. Right, so if we go to sharing, so this is chapter 9, early 19th century poets. So if you go to page 91, so as I said here, the mainstream of poetry in the 18th century, this is the century before the earlier century, where we call it the Age of Reason. So the poetry at that time was orderly and polished, without much feeling for nature. There was no feeling for nature. It was a sort of neoclassical. They were interested more in the form of poetry, and things were like logic and discussing thoughts and ideas. But here we see more representation of a poet's feelings, according even to the definition of poetry by the Romantic poet William Wordsworth. At that time, in the 18th century, the previous century, we have heroic couplets were used for this verse. But various writers had broken away from the form and the thought. So now we start to see a change. now poets start to break away, to go away from this, from focus on the form or focus on the thought and ideas. And so lyrical ballads, which was, as I said, a collection of poems, lyrical ballads. Okay, and you can have a definition here in the footnote of a ballad. A ballad is a simple poem in short stanzas telling a story. You know, this is called a ballad. And you must have studied it in Introduction to Literature course. So these lyrical ballads is like a collection of poems published in 1798 by two poets, William Wordsworth and Samuel Coleridge. So the appearance, this lyrical ballads marked a change. It was like a shock here, as the writer describes, because it was considered a kind of drastic change, a revolutionary change in the way poets would write poetry. The critics considered the language too simple. So now we move to a language that's simple, a language that is used in the everyday life, as William Wordsworth describes it, by the farmers, by the countrymen. And the change too violent. So this was a kind of drastic change, sudden change, too much. This important book, the Lyrical Ballads, the signal of the beginning of the Romantic Age. So it marked the beginning of the Romantic Age. It was a joint work of, two poets published it, William Wordsworth and Samuel Taylor Coleridge. Both are important literary figures in the Romantic school of poetry. Together with another poet called Southey, you remember this Southey? He's a minor poet, but together with them, Robert Southey, they are known as the Lake Poets. The Lake Poets. Why? Because they like the Lake District in the northwest of England. There is an area in the northwest of England called the Lake District, and they liked it, and they lived in that area, and uh, it features in many of their poems. It's there. This nature or the area is there in their poetry as well. So that's why they were known as the Lake Poets. So the first of these poets, William Wordsworth, the most famous, a pioneer in the Romantic school of poetry. He was a poet of nature. He loved nature so much. Um, he had this special ability to throw a charm over ordinary things. So he would often pick up a very ordinary topic and he writes beautiful poetry about it. So if he sees a flower, some flowers there beside the lake, like the flowers he described in the daffodils, I wander lonely as a cloud. So he would write something beautiful or some kind of um, um, poetry about these simple phenomena in nature. He would write about flowers, about trees, about birds, about the landscape, about ordinary scenes in nature that people may pass by without even observing them. So he had this kind of special vision as a point. And as I said in while I introduced him in the beginning, he was accompanied most of the time by his sister Dorothy. She was also a literary figure, and she would write, record the things he does in his everyday activities. Coleridge, on the other hand, could make mysterious events acceptable to a reader's mind. So Coleridge was a point of, extraordinary imagination. He would take the reader to worlds beyond the everyday life. Okay, and perhaps this might be because of the influence of um, the opium as well. He is a point that is living in another world. But anyway, in general, neither William Morris. Whereas nowhere, Coleridge used the old language of poetry. So the old language of poetry, the language of the previous century, of the 18th century, they left it and they started to use simple, plain language, a language that is used by people, the farmers, the men in the countryside in their everyday life. So what you need to know is Wordsworth was so filled with the love of nature. I'm sure you are studying a particular course in this term, in the poetry course, and the romantic poets are there. But still, this is part of our course. Wordsworth was so filled with the love of nature that in later editions of the Lyrical Ballads, he said that the language of poetry ought to be the same language of a simple farm worker. So this is the language of poetry that he advocated for, the language of simple people, simple farm workers. So the language of poetry in the school of the romantics is no longer the language of the elite, ليست لغة الخاصة, but the simple language of farm workers, of ordinary people, الناس العاديين. Okay. Um, which means that these romantic poets were not living separated or isolated from life or from nature, although they are known as escapists, like but they escape from cities. They don't escape from nature. They escape from crowded places because they like nature. They like nature. Uh, Coleridge, Samuel Taylor Coleridge has a poem called "The Rime of the Ancient Mariner." The rime of the ancient mariner, or sailor. So the rhyme, the song of the ancient mariner. And this poem actually appeared in the first edition of the Lyrical Palace. This is one of the poems in the collection of poetry called Lyrical Palace. So this is a story. An old sailor describes some strange misfortunes that happened to his ship. It's like a story, okay, but written in verse. I'd like you to remember these lines. I mean, they belong to the rhyme of the ancient mariner. Alone, alone, all alone. Alone on a wide, wide sea, and never a saint took pity on me. My soul in agony. You see how simple the language is. You can easily understand every single word here. And look at the music and the image created by this simple language. Okay, let alone the story is very much interesting and inspiring. Um, these are just samples of romantic poetry. Okay, we also come here, we just jump to this. Two other important poems by Coleridge, but they are not there in the Lyrical Ballads, are Christabel, was published in 1816, and Coblacan, again in 1816. And neither was finished, so he left these two poems uncompleted. He didn't have a chance to complete them because he was interrupted when he wrote them. But there is again magic in each. So there is magic and mystery in each of these poems. Um, so this is a story of writing Kubla Khan. Once, when Coleridge was staying in Devon, a place in England, he fell asleep while reading in Purchas his Pilgrims. Okay, see page 30. If you go back to page 30 to check this. About Kubla Khan's great building in Xanadu. Kubla Khan was actually the grandson of Genghis Khan. On waking, he knew that he had dreamed several hundred poetic lines on the subject. So he had this vision or dream when he was asleep, and when he woke up, he started to remember these lines. So he began at once to write them down. But unluckily, he was interrupted. So someone interrupted his stream of thought and was never again able to remember the rest. So he just wrote part of the poem, and the poem was never completed. So this is the beginning of the poem. In Xanadu did Kubla Khan a stately pleasure dome decree where Alf, the sacred river, ran through cavernous, measureless to man, down to a sunless sea. This is beautiful language describing um, um, how this Kubla Khan was built and how he started to order the building of Kubla Khan. If you bear with me for a second. So this tells us how creative Coleridge was, that he would even dream of writing poetry, and when he wakes up, he starts to write down that. So Kubla Khan is, as you see, a lyrical. This is a lyrical, and at the same time narrative, because we have a story here. You remember, narrative means we have a story, but we have a story that is written in a form of uh, poetry, a poem. So it begins like a story. So we have a narrator here, somebody narrating a story, and he introduces to us Kubla Khan. Okay, and his decree, his order. He ordered the construction of a stately pleasure dome. Okay, where it should be constructed besides a sacred river, the Alf, Alf River. Okay, a sacred river, and an area which is precisely measured through caverns, measureless to man. Interesting, interesting poem that you should remember its title and the beginning of it as well. The Kubla Khan, as I said, a great conqueror um, who completed the subjugation of China, and he was the grandson of the great Genghis Khan. So he ordered this magnificent pleasure palace to be built. He wanted a palace to be built for him in Xanadu, a place. Xanadu is his summer capital. So where the palace should be situated? The palace was to be situated on the bank of the sacred river Alf, the bank of sacred river Alf, which flowing through the sacred river ran, throwing through immeasurably deep caves, and ultimately sank into a dark subterranean sea. This is a river. Right. So this is as far as Coleridge is concerned. So William Wordsworth has a part as well in the Lyrical Palace. Okay, so one of the poems is called Lines Written Above Tintern Abbey. Look at this is what a quotation from him. But often in lonely rooms and mild din of towns and cities, I have owed to them in hours of weariness sensations sweet, felt in the blood and felt along the heart. Interesting, simple language, clear meanings, has to do with feelings. Among his best sonnets as well, Westminster Bridge, emotional view of London asleep. And also he has a poem called London, um, published in 1802. Again, short poems like The Daffodils, I Wandered Lonely as a Cloud, or otherwise known as I Wandered Lonely as a Cloud, The Solitary Reaper, and Lucy. These are poems by William Wordsworth. And then we move on. Wordsworth also wrote the prelude. Prelude means introduction or a preface to something. A record in 14th books of verse of Wordsworth on progress in poetry and thought. So this is about his own development in poetry and thought as well. It was written during the years 1799 and until 1805. Um, this is as far as Wordsworth is concerned. We move on to a third poet, George Gordon, or otherwise known as Lord Byron. He was also a romantic figure, but his poetry was much influenced by the classical form of Pope, Alexander Pope. So Byron was a bit influenced by the classical form of Pope. So he was a bit interested in Greece, and he spent some of his time there. His poetry, but his poetry, though powerful, lacks the finest poetic imagination. His words mean only what they say and have no further magic. The only poem we should remember about him, two poems, is um, Child Harold, okay, written in Spenserian stanza, as you see, okay, and Don Juan, written from 1818 to 1824. A long poem of astonishing adventure, but it is a satire which attacks some of Byron's enemies. So these are the only poems I'd like you to know by um, Lord Byron. We move on. We come an important poet, which is called Percy Bysshe Shelley. Percy Bysshe Shelley. He was a great poet of good family. He comes from a rich family, actually. Restless. He is always full of activities and rich. He traveled a lot. He struggled against the causes of human misery and against accepted religions. You remember that pamphlet which he published, and because of which he was expelled from Oxford University. So he saw goodness in the whole of nature, and he wanted all men to be free. His first potent poem, Alastor, or The Spirit of Solitude. Yes, remember this word solitude. This is one of the distinguishing features of romantic poets, solitude. They like to spend their time with nature and lonely. Even the Daffodils by William Wordsworth, he said, I wandered lonely, alone. So solitude. The poem is written in blank verse and shows Wordsworth's influence. It showed that Percy Shelley was influenced by William Wordsworth. Um, Another important poem by him is Prometheus Unbound. Okay, on the Greek model. Prometheus was like a figure in the Greek mythology. It deals with human struggle against the power of false gods. Adonais, one of the best poems. This is an elegy. You remember the meaning of elegy? A sad poem written on a sad occasion, like the death of someone. On the death of Keats. Here he wrote it when Keats, another poem we're going to see soon. John Keats was his friend. When he died, he wrote this poem, Adonais. Shelley loved the wild wind, so he wrote these poems like Ode to the West Wind. But John Keats, the last poet we discussed here, he loved beauty and rest. John Keats. So this is as far as Shelley is concerned. We just need to know something about him and that he wrote these poems, Prometheus Unbound and Adonais. Keats, as we discussed him, his early poem Endymion. Endymion, again, was like a son of a shepherd, and he was, again, borrowed from Greek mythology. based on old ideas, the old gods, the love of the moon goddess of for a shepherd, Endymion. So this is a shepherd. Endymion was a shepherd. Um, he wrote some odes. Other great odes written at about the same time are Ode to a Nightingale, My Heart Aches, Ode to Autumn, Season of Mists. Okay. So Keats wrote poetry of rich detail and accused Shelley of using language which was too thin. These are the poems I'd like you to know, because so many titles in this chapter, so many figures, and you will start to get confused because so far we have studied many poets and many writers. So another poet as well. We have some other poets, but they are less important than these ones, like Thomas Campbell, but just focus on the ones I have given to you. All right. So I'd like you to listen to the lecture and revise, write down notes, write down questions if you have, and send them back to me through the WhatsApp if you have any questions. But the more you read in the history of English literature, the more you can still remember these names and their poems. But what I may do for you is to draw a map, a kind of a map for each age, which delineates the main figures and their main works, so you can have this kind of organized information in your minds that may cling to your memory longer. Thank you very much for your interest and for watching the video. And if, as I said before, if you have any questions, just send it to me via the media such as WhatsApp, or send it to my email. I'll be happy and pleased to answer you back. Thank you very much.